Hello ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to the channel. And today I'm going to go my review of WCW's Halloween Havoc 1997. Starting off the evening, we'll go to our first match of the night. It is Yuji Nagata versus Ultimo Dragon. I thought this was a good match to start Halloween Havoc 1997. Back and forth matchup between Yuji Nagata and Ultimo Dragon, with the Dragon keeping the pace of the match. Nagata then hits a pile driver on the Dragon. It looked absolutely brutal. Raven and his flock are shown walking through the crowd while this match was going on. Dragon then hits a moonsault off the top rope on Nagata. Nagata then lands multiple kicks on the Dragon. Dragon then quickly applies a Dragon Sleeper, but Nagata breaks the hold. Dragon and Nagata both exchange in the middle of the ring, with Dragon hitting a Frankensteiner on Nagata, but Nagata ultimately applies an armbar on Ultimo Dragon, and your winner of the match by submission is Yuji Nagata. Hats off to Yuji Nagata for getting the win in that matchup. Moving on from that, we go into our next match of the night. It is Chris Jericho versus Gato. I thought this was an okay matchup. Back and forth matchup between Gato and Jericho, with Jericho keeping the pace of the match. Jericho ends up hitting a humongous botched Frankensteiner off the top rope on Gato that looked absolutely brutal. It actually could have ended his career the way he landed. But Jericho ultimately applies his signature walls of Jericho on Gato, and your winner of the match by submission is Chris Jericho. Hats off to Chris Jericho for getting the win in this matchup. Moving on from that, we go into our next match of the night. It is Eddie Guerrero versus Rey Mysterio Jr. in a title versus mask match. I thought this was a great match. Back and forth matchup between Guerrero and Mysterio, with Mysterio keeping the pace of the match. Mysterio then hits a springboard moonsault into a DDT on Guerrero that looked absolutely brutal. Mysterio then hits a somersault to a hurricanrana on Guerrero to the outside. Guerrero then gets up, hits a devastating powerbomb on Mysterio for a near fall, but Mysterio ultimately hits his signature Frankensteiner on Guerrero, pins for the 3, and your winner of the match, and at that time new WCW Cruiserweight Champion, is Rey Mysterio Jr. Hats off to Rey Mysterio Jr. for getting the win in that matchup. Moving on from that, we go into our next match of the night. It is Alex Wright versus Steve McMichael. I thought this was an okay matchup. Back and forth matchup between Wright and McMichael, with Wright keeping the pace of the match. McMichael ends up hitting a tombstone pile driver on Alex Wright, but Goldberg ends up showing up. Goldberg ends up hitting a spear on McMichael, with the referee being distracted. And then Goldberg hits his signature jackhammer on McMichael as well. Alex Wright then goes for the cover, pins for the 3, and your winner of the match is Alex Wright. Hats off to Alex Wright for getting the win in that matchup. Moving on from that, we go into our next match of the night. It is Jacqueline versus Disco Inferno. I thought this was an awful match. Back and forth matchup between Jacqueline and Disco Inferno. Inferno made a point to run around the ring consistently, trying to stay away from Jacqueline. But Jacqueline ultimately hits the roll up on Inferno, pins for the 3, and your winner of the match is Jacqueline. Hats off to Jacqueline for getting the win in that matchup. Moving on from that, we go into our next match of the night. It is Ric Flair versus Curt Hennig. I thought this was a great match. Back and forth matchup between Flair and Hennig, with Flair keeping the pace of the match. Flair and Hennig both exchange chops in the middle of the ring, but Flair ultimately hits the referee, and your winner of the match due to disqualification is Curt Hennig. Hats off to Curt Hennig for getting the win in this matchup. Moving on from that, we go into our next match of the night. It is Lex Luger versus Scott Hall, with special guest referee Larry Zbyszko. I thought this was an okay matchup. Back and forth matchup between Lex and Hall, with Lex Luger keeping the pace of the match. Hall hits a fallaway slam on Lex. Six is ringside. Six ends up attacking Lex Luger, with the referee being distracted, which allows Scott Hall to hit the outsider's edge on Lex Luger. Pins for the 3, and your winner of the match is Scott Hall. Hats off to Scott Hall for getting the win in that matchup. Moving on from that, we go into our next match of the night. It is Diamond Dallas Page versus Randy Savage. I thought this was a good matchup. Back and forth matchup between DDP and Savage, with DDP keeping the pace of the match. Miss Elizabeth is ringside. She ends up attacking Diamond Dallas Page. Kimberly makes her way out to the ring. Kimberly ends up attacking Miss Elizabeth. Randy then ultimately hits an elbow drop on DDP. But DDP gets up, hits a diamond cutter on Randy Savage. Randy then gets up, hits a low blow on Diamond Dallas Page. And your winner of the match by pinfall is Randy Savage. Hats off to Randy Savage for getting the win in this matchup. Moving on from that, we go into our next match of the night. It is the main event of Halloween Havoc's 1997. It is Roddy Piper versus Hollywood Hogan in a steel cage match. I thought this was a good matchup. Back and forth matchup between Piper and Hogan, with Piper keeping the pace of the match. Piper then applies his signature sleeper hold on Hogan, and your winner of the match by submission is Roddy Piper. A couple of things I'm going to say about Halloween Havoc 1997 before I get out of here, man. Number one, this was a decent event. I'm not going to say it was the best Halloween Havoc I ever seen. Absolutely not. There were some matches on here that were halfway decent. Yuji Nagata versus Ultimo Dragon, solid matchup. A lot of people don't know who Yuji Nagata is, but he's a big star over in New Japan. And he's had a tremendous career over in Japan, by the way. Gato versus Chris Jericho. A lot of people don't know who Gato is. From what I understand, I think he did some work with FMW over in Japan with Onita's Corporation. I think he also did some work with ECW as well. Kind of like a journeyman's wrestler, if you will. I don't know a whole lot about Gato. But supposedly back then, Jericho and Gato were both rivals. And this is one of the reasons why they booked this matchup, according to Tony Schiavone in 1997. But what I will say is the botch Frankensteiner that Jericho hit, I mean, it's still being talked about to this day. I mean, that Frankensteiner easily could have ended his career. When Jericho had landed, he landed on the back of his head, man, and it looked absolutely brutal. So I don't know how. I mean, Jericho was definitely lucky that night to not only land, not have his career ended, but actually win that matchup against Gato. So it was a solid matchup between Jericho and Gato. To me, the match of the night, hands down, was Eddie Guerrero versus Rey Mysterio Jr., title versus mass match. It has been heavily documented that in 1997, this was the match of the year. To me, you got two of the best in the world to ever do it with Eddie Guerrero and Rey Mysterio Jr. I mean, this was a solid match, man. This match right here easily could have main evented Halloween Havoc in 1997. I mean, no disrespect to Piper and Hogan, but this match easily could have been the main event. It was a solid match. There was moves that Mysterio was pulling out that no one has ever seen before. I mean, that springboard moonsault DDT was absolutely crazy. And not everybody's ever, a lot of people didn't see that move before, man. And Mysterio in WCW was one hell of a superstar. Absolutely, man. So much talent with Rey Mysterio at that time, man. It was unreal. And again, it's the same thing with Eddie Guerrero. I was a big Guerrero fan growing up, and it goes to show you, man, how much time and effort and how much talent between these two guys had in the ring. I mean, multi-time champions, Hall of Famers. I mean, solid match from top to bottom, man. That was probably my favorite match of Halloween Havoc 1997 between Eddie and Rey Mysterio for the title versus mass match. Alex Wright versus Steve McMichael. It was a decent match. I think the biggest thing taken away from that match was Goldberg. And what I mean by that is at this point, at this pay-per-view, a lot of people really didn't know who Goldberg was. People were hearing about his name. Yeah, he showed up on Nitro, yada, yada, yada. But no one knew what kind of caliber of superstar that, Eric Bischoff and WCW were really trying to make Goldberg at that time. And I think it was Goldberg's first pay-per-view debut, if you will, even though he didn't have a match. He ended up showing up and creating the storyline between Steve Mongo McMichael, due to the fact that obviously Goldberg, played football for, the Atlanta Falcons, played football for the University of Georgia. McMichael also played college football. He also played for the Bears, one of the best defenses at that time when McMichael was playing. If I'm not mistaken, I'm pretty sure it was the 85 Bears that McMichael was playing on. Jacqueline versus Disco Inferno, awful matchup. Look, man, if you're a Disco Inferno fan, God bless you. God bless you, man, because at the end of the day, it goes hand in hand with what I said about Buff Bagwell. Do I think Buff Bagwell is a better wrestler than Inferno? Yeah. With that being said, do I think NWO really helped Bagwell and Disco Inferno in their careers at that time? 100%. 100%. And for what it's worth, I think Bagwell is not only the better wrestler than Disco Inferno, but I stated this multiple times in the past as well. Bagwell's singles run was awful. Now, when he was teaming up with Too Cold Scorpio, and they were a tag team being trained, or not trained, but being mentored and managed by Teddy Long, I think that tag team as a whole gelled perfectly together. You had the high flying with Too Cold Scorpio, who's an absolute legend, made a great name for himself over in ECW, by the way. And then you also have Bagwell, who's more of the mat wrestler, and and it's not going to be really doing any kind of crazy high flying maneuvers. Now, credit Bagwell, finisher move years later was the blockbuster, which was pretty much a front flip off the middle rope into like a neck breaker. So, long story short, I think, Disco Inferno is not that great of a wrestler. And I'm sorry if you're a fan of his, man. I mean, I'm personally not. I think Jeff Jarrett's a million times better of a wrestler than Disco Inferno. And for me, that's saying a lot. I feel like Disco Inferno really did put the time and effort in to become a pro wrestler. And, that might be a tough pill to swallow, man. But at the end of the day, Disco Inferno can't wrestle. And the NWO really saved his career. And that's just me being honest as a fan, man. That's not me trying to, shoot jabs at Disco Inferno. It's just, that's the way it is. NWO saved this man's career. It wasn't like a lot of people were really fully on invested on what Disco Inferno was doing. Really. I mean, yeah, maybe he was television champion. But this was a time where, WCW was kind of heading towards the toilet, if you ask me. I mean, 98, 99? I mean, it was... A lot of people were leaving, WCW even at that time, and it wasn't the same. A lot of the stuff for WCW was being pushed by guys like Goldberg or Kevin Nash or Scott Hall, Randy Savage, DDP, Sting. That was the main storylines going into what I believe was like 98, 99. Goldberg played a humongous role in WCW in 98. So, especially Sting. I mean, you figure Sting took, that huge sabbatical and then came back as the Crow Sting and then kind of teased the character for almost about a year leading up to Starrcade 1997 when he had that historic match between him and Hollywood Hogan at Starrcade. So, I wasn't a big fan of the Jacqueline Disco Inferno match at all. And again, I don't know why WCW and Eric Bischoff were really pushing Disco Inferno at that time. I have no idea. Ric Flair and Kurt Hennig, solid matchup. Absolute two legends, man. Rest in peace to Kurt Hennig. This was just a follow-up of the storyline that was heading after what happened after Fall Brawl, after Kurt Hennig turned on the Horsemen and allowed, the NWO to get the win over the Horsemen in the War Games match. And obviously Kurt Hennig was, pretty much aligning himself with the NWO. So this was kind of a revenge match, if you will, for Ric Flair after what Hennig did to the Horsemen in the War Games match at Fall Brawl. Moving on from that, we have Lex Luger and Scott Hall with special guest referee Larry Zbyszko. I thought this was an okay matchup. I mean, big fan of Scott Hall as well. Obviously, Razor Ramon, one of his all-time greatest characters. For me, as a pro wrestling fan. Lex Luger, again, solid athlete. The biggest thing I took away from this match was Larry Zbyszko and how much he was involved in this match and the storyline that he was pushing, the narrative that he despised NWO, said that Scott Hall can't wrestle. And, he really didn't like the NWO. And I like the way the storyline was going because, that's one thing that WCW did very well, in my honest opinion, was this inner turmoil between WCW and NWO because even though they were all under the same company, NWO was seeing themselves as its own private entity, not being the same as, the WCW roster. So, that's one of the greatest storylines, I think, in all professional wrestling was NWO versus WCW because it went on for so long, ever since, Nash and Hall came over and they, joined forces with Hogan. I mean, it was always an internal battle between WCW guys and NWO guys, and it was always awesome to see. So, great storyline. DDP versus Randy Savage, again, solid matchup. And obviously Piper versus Hogan in the steel cage match. And this is the other thing I'm going to say about WCW that I actually did appreciate. A lot of the legends that had wrestled under Vince and WWE in the early 90s, they really weren't getting pushed. The main one was Randy Savage. I mean, a lot of the matches, I believe it was even WrestleMania 10 that they had Randy on, if I'm not mistaken, they had Randy Savage on commentary. And even on Monday Night Raw, a lot of things that Randy was doing was being on commentary. And Randy still had a lot of left, he had a lot left in the tank. I mean, even his WCW run was fantastic. I personally think so. And that's not me just saying that as a Randy Savage fan. I think the amount of, the body of work that he put in WCW, joining the NWO, and the matches he had with Hogan, Diamond Dallas Page, multi-time world champion. I think Randy had a great career for himself in WCW, to be honest with you. And guys like Randy, guys like Piper, those guys were getting pushed out. And even Hogan. I truly believe Hogan was, when he was in WWE towards the end, Hogan was eventually going to get pushed out if Hogan didn't leave to go to WCW. If he wanted to, stay as Hulk Hogan and wanted to wrestle, I think he would have been on the same boat as Randy. I think he would have been doing commentary and being pretty much an ambassador for the company at that time. With the name of Hollywood Hogan or Hulk Hogan, it's going to put, butts in seats, man. And that's exactly what it was. And I think that's the reason why Randy went to WCW and he was offered a contract from Eric Bischoff and Ted Turner to come over to WCW. And it was the same thing with Hogan. A lot of those guys, I wouldn't even say the same thing about Lex Luger. I think Lex Luger's best run that he's ever had is under WCW. Even in the early days of NWA, when he was, with Jim Crockett, I think Lex Luger, as far as in-ring ability, in-ring talent, and him actually wanting to wrestle, his better days were under, Crockett and Turner. I think his run in WWE just, it wasn't there. I don't think he wanted to be there. I don't think he was really invested in what WWE was doing at the time. And, it seemed like he really wasn't having fun. And you've seen documentaries about, Lex Luger being on the Lex Express and that whole storyline where it was Lex Luger versus Yokozuna when he had body slammed Yokozuna on the USS Intrepid. So, I mean, this was after the fact that Hogan had left. So they were putting the entire company on this guy's back, and he just did not want to be there. And personally, as a fan, I'm going to say that, Vince and WWE dropped the ball severely with putting the company on Luger's back when you had a guy that was in your repertoire, if you will, in your roster, that was one of the best ever doing. That's Bret Hart. I think the company should have put a lot of the stakes they had on Bret. I think Bret is 100% a company guy. I really do. I think that Bret would have done a fantastic job with carrying the banner of WWE, where Lex really dropped the ball. And even after the Lex Express, I mean, the next thing they really did for Lex was teaming him up with Davey Boy Smith, the British Bulldog. And is it a solid tag team? Yeah. I mean, from top to bottom, yeah, it's a solid tag team, man. Two powerhouses. I mean, Davey Boy Smith is one of the strongest wrestlers I've ever seen. Very athletic, very strong. I mean, it's the same thing with Lex Luger. He's very athletic, very strong. But the tag team really didn't work, and there was really nothing more to do with Lex. I mean, they tried to recreate Lex, if you will, when they tried to team him up or have Bobby Heenan manage him as the narcissist Lex Luger, and I still believe that's Lex's best character he's ever had. But they dropped the ball, man. And long story short, a lot of these guys that were originally with WWE, and came over to WCW, they had a hell of a career for themselves. I mean, when it's all said and done, I think Randy, if he never went over to WCW, it would have been it for Randy, to be honest with you. I don't think there was much more left for Randy to do if he didn't go over to WCW. And the same thing with, Lex Luger and those type of guys, man. Those guys just didn't, there was more for him on the other side of the fence, and that was WCW. So, but DDP, Randy Savage, solid match. But all in all, I mean, a lot of it came down to the main event, how they were booking it, Hogan versus Piper. It was a solid match, but at the end of the day, I mean, a lot of the main storyline too with this match was Hogan didn't want to come to the ring because he was fearful of Sting showing up, and Sting was constantly trying to threat the NWO. He was always in the arena trying to taunt the NWO, and Hogan just had enough, and this was literally leading up to Hogan versus Sting at Starrcade, and it was one of the biggest return matches in WCW, with Sting returning after taking that, long sabbatical from, in-ring, any kind of in-ring stuff that he was doing with WCW. He took time off. He recreated his character, came back, and this, what we all know now is the Crow Sting. And it was one of the greatest character creations of all time, honestly. And hats off to Eric Bischoff for that. I mean, I think Bischoff definitely had a lot to say on the Sting character. I do. And it paid off for Sting, man. Sting has had a hell of a career. Still wrestling till this day, man. It's absolutely insane. But as far as Halloween Havoc 1997, as far as a rating is concerned, you guys know by now, 1 being the worst, 10 being the absolute best. And honestly, for what it's worth to y'all, man, I was really back and forth on the rating that I wanted to give Halloween Havoc 1997 because there was a lot of decent matches on this card. So Based upon all the matches that I actually enjoyed on this card, whether it was Eddie versus Ray, the title versus mass match, you had DDP versus Randy Savage, obviously Piper versus Hogan as well. I'm going to have to give Halloween Havoc 1997 a solid rating of a 6.5 at best. But this is my review of Halloween Havoc 1997. I hope you guys are out there staying safe, be careful, and remember, stay classic. Peace.